Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Podcast series. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Gregg Roman, director here at the Middle East Forum, join us to discuss moving Israel towards victory. Mr. Roman will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Gregg Roman.
Thank you very much, Stacey. The trip to Israel that I had the opportunity to take part in, which was a larger effort by the Middle East Forum's Board of Governors, and really a fact-finding mission, which took place from last Sunday until the following Friday. So almost a week ago, we came back to the United States, was one unlike any other trip that I've taken to Israel. I lived in the country for 8 years, from 2006 to 2013. I visited there many times when I was in college, and I've been back there almost every summer since I started working at the Middle East Forum. The Israel I saw, 3.5 months post-October 7th, versus the one that I left last year when I was there in the fall prior to October 7th, has completely been changed. It has completely evolved into a country that is very much at war, but not one that feels like it's losing, like it may have felt in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, but one that sees the need for victory being an existential part of the country's reason for being. I'm going to try to talk about a few things on today's podcast. The first is the current state of affairs in the aftermath of arguably Israel's largest military and intelligence failure in the country's history. The trip that I took me to the tense borders of Gaza and Lebanon. It took us to meetings in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, both with members of Knesset and ministers, but also security officials. The more intense meetings took place with members of families whose sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, husbands and wives are currently being held hostage in Gaza by Hamas. And we also had the opportunity to meet with those who have lost loved ones in the war. I want to strip away the veneer and get to the hard truths of what our fact-finding mission uncovered. And I hope to answer your tough questions, questions that I asked towards Israel's security establishment, questions about leadership changes, and most importantly, the path forward in Israel's policy towards the Palestinians. I think that the October 7th events, as I said beforehand, didn't just mark one of Israel's worst military intelligence oversights, but it also served as a clarion wake-up call to the nation. In the wake of this, I hope to assess on this trip how the country has evolved amidst what can only be described as one of my colleagues recently wrote, a seven-front war. The resilience and determination of Israelis was palpable, but the question still remained: has the security establishment learned from its mistakes? I'll first take you to my visit to the Gaza border. It was eye-opening. When you drive into Sderot and you see the police station that was attacked by Hamas on October 7th, there's nothing left. It's now hallowed ground. The entire debris which was there has literally been removed after the station was destroyed. The people that you talk to there, of which about a third of the population has now returned after the city had been evacuated in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, are chiseled. They have grit. They have this steely determination in their eyes that they demand that their army and that their government do not stop in Gaza until Hamas and every other Palestinian faction no longer provides a threat, both to the city and to the nation. And as you leave Sderot and you get closer to Kfar Aza, kibbutz that we visited, you start to realize that there is a mass of Israeli troops both going to and fro Gaza. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery pieces, the slow buzzing of drones in the sky, faint booms coming from airstrikes and artillery hits in the south of the country, the south of Gaza rather, where Israel still embarked on its campaign in Khan Yunis and preparing to take over Rafah on the Gaza-Egyptian border, that these are not a group of individuals who are just doing their reserve service. They're not going into a limited campaign. These are hundreds of thousands of reservists, of troops, the civilians who are supporting them around the Israel-Gaza border that have been struck, have been changed for the course of their lifespan by the violence that was perpetrated against them on the 7th and by the military actions that they've had to carry out since fighting back against Hamas started later on October 8th. But you also feel this tension that's there. It's sort of a silent testament to the ongoing conflict, the security measures, the fortifications, the narratives that people tell you when you visit the burnt out buildings, which are only half a kilometer away from where Hamas breached the Israeli border fence and carried out a massacre of Kfar Aza. And when you get a little bit closer to the Gaza border and you make your way past Kfar Aza and you make your way to the site of the Nova Music Festival, where over 300 Israelis were killed, right next to Kibbutz Be'eri, those individuals, they're almost as if though they're living in the shadow of Gaza and they're trying to tell a story about a nation that is indeed hardened and remain on edge, but they have something greater that they want to ask of you. Whether you're speaking English or Hebrew, they are saying that when you go back to your home in the United States, we need you to make sure that Israel can achieve victory. And you ask them, well, we know that you have to beat Hamas, but what does victory look like? And they give you a simple answer. They say, this is to ensure that such a failure is never to be repeated. And the actions which took place prior to October 7th will have their time to be evaluated, but we cannot have this happen again. That is unmistakable in their determination when they talk about what happened. But speaking to the security issues, the big question on a lot of, I think, American readers' minds and those who are not present in the country is what have been the real changes in leadership, both within Israel's security and political establishment since October 7th. From my observations, discussions with the security experts that we met, there's a mix of skepticism and cautious optimism. A general that we sat down with on the first evening of our trip there said, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces of October 8th, is not the Israel Defense Forces of October 7th. There's initiatives now that we've heard about overhauling intelligence and operational readiness. There's a certain uptick in the pace and transparency of these reforms, but they are still the subject of intense debate behind closed doors. Because the question, when you get to the political leadership of what do you think went wrong on October 7th is, we'll deal with this after the war is over. We have to win first, and then we can address the problems at a later time. But also you have to ask the question, not just about the operational readiness of the IDF and what led to the events of October 7th. We have to ask a wider strategic question. What about Israel's policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians? You can see even from reading the articles that are coming out in the news. Yesterday, for instance, Prime Minister Netanyahu released his first white paper on what the day after the war will look like in Gaza. But even further beyond that, in closed meetings of the war cabinet, rumors that you hear from reporters who can't necessarily repeat it because of a military censor order or just for the fact that it's been unconfirmed by more than one source, that there's an undercurrent of reevaluation. And as was just a broad testament to Israeli politicians' rejection of there being any future Palestinian state in the near term by a vote of the Knesset, which just took place, was 99 members of Knesset that voted against the possible recognition. And this was a symbolic resolution brought in the Knesset, but 99 members of Knesset voted against a Israeli recognition of a two-state solution in the near future. There is a consensus among experts that I spoke with that a more intelligent policy about the Palestinians, not one of deterrence and not one of trying to kick the can down the road to another government, is not just desirable, but it's necessary. The strategy that I see moving forward is one to increase deterrence by increasing Israeli Defense Force strength, aiming to both demilitarize threats while they are growing instead of waiting for them to become one that is something that can hurt Israel, while still seeking pathways to limited Palestinian local governance. And this means getting rid of UNRWA. This means dismantling the Palestinian Authority. This means getting rid of any of the vestiges of Hamas, which were involved in civil governance in Gaza. And it means a complete rethink of how Israel's army and also its politicians deal with the Palestinian question. It also allows a more nuanced approach, which suggests a shift, albeit gradual, towards addressing the root causes of the conflict rather than merely its symptoms. And this was brought out by Prime Minister Netanyahu in his white paper yesterday, where he didn't just talk about how Palestinians govern themselves, but also how they're educated. And I think the Israeli government will pursue a policy of de-radicalization, but there's not really any specifics on what that looks like right now. Moving back to Prime Minister Netanyahu's leadership and his actions since October 7th, from all the individuals we spoke with, you can certainly see that it's been under the microscope. His critics argue that his response was slow. The measures that he took to secure Israel's southern border were insufficiently robust, and they're calling for his resignation. However, his supporters, and he still does have some in government and even in the military, are pointing to his strategic recalibration of Israel's defense and foreign policy since October 7th, being willing to speak more stridently out against Prime Minister Rahul Seth of the United Kingdom, being able to demand things that he has been speaking about since 2009 when he became prime minister for the second time. And he has been prime minister for all but 1.5 years since 2009. And finally getting to the point where he realizes that Palestinians aren't just something that can be delayed and appeased, but have to be dealt with. My assessment, based on the wide range of opinions that I encountered, and that comes from having served in the Israeli government in some direct positions under those who served with Netanyahu, is that Netanyahu is navigating a complex landscape, attempting to balance both his own personal political career with the long-term geopolitical strategies that Israel requires. But in the long run, he realizes that when a state commission of inquiry comes, and the majority of people we spoke with, including those from both opposition and government parties, realize that a state commission of inquiry will be convened, that I believe he will be held responsible. And the Israeli electorate and members of his own Likud party will have to deal with that. I don't know if that will be before the next election, but you can also sense, at least through opinion polls and what people are talking about, that even if one looks at how Israelis are polling right now in terms of if there were to be a Knesset election held tomorrow, that an overwhelming majority of them would vote for Benny Gantz and his National Union Party. That would bring Gantz and Eisenkot and Gideon Sa'ar and other Israeli politicians who currently serve in the war cabinet, either as members or observers, into the position of potentially prime minister, defense minister, and foreign minister. But that also beckons the fact that because Netanyahu has another 3.5 years left on his government term, and the members of his coalition are also polling downwards, that there's no real motivation for them to go right now. So you'll have political deadlock, but I think once the war's over, you'll have a majority of Israelis who will be calling for his resignation. If not after the war, then after a commission of inquiry holds him responsible for the events of October 7th. I'd also like, just for the last minute before we get into questions, to talk about a particularly impactful part of my trip, which was meeting with the families of hostages and those who have lost loved ones in the Gaza war. Their stories are heart-wrenching, a reminder of the human cost of conflict. Yet amidst the grief, there's a powerful sense of resolve and a near unanimous call for a secure, victorious Israel that can prevent further tragedies. The hostage families are split into 3 camps. One, led by the Tikva Forum, an organization which was created after October 7th, says that they do not want the next Gilad Shalit deal which they speak of with their own family members who are being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza, to be the reason for another October 7th to happen. There's another group which are calling for a deal at almost any cost, including the release of thousands of Palestinian security prisoners from Israeli jails. But there's also a third group who we don't hear from. And these are the families of senior Shin Bet, Israeli intelligence, and other high-ranking officers that may be being held by Hamas right now. They've been instructed by the security establishment to not speak out because of the risk that they may portend to those who are being held hostage's identity. Now, as a postscript, we also did visit the Lebanese border, and there is also an iron resolve to make sure that Hezbollah can no longer pose an anti-tank threat to Israel citizens who have been evacuated from the north, some 30 to 40,000 who are no longer able to go back to their homes. I think that if the IDF that is now fighting in Gaza turns its focus to Hezbollah in the north, Hassan Nasrallah has a lot to worry about. So in sum, the leadership's under scrutiny. They're tasked with charting a course that avoids past mistakes, and they have been charged with securing the nation's future. There's hope that a more intelligent policy towards Palestinians will be not just a matter of strategic necessity, but of moral imperative to protect Israeli lives. The voices of the Israeli people and that select group of interlocutors who are close to power demand that the strategy for Israel will not just be one of survival, but one of a lasting peace that ensures strength for Israel's army, security for its people, and to make sure that the tragedies of the past are not repeated. Stacey?
All right, thank you so much. First question we have is from British international lawyer Andrew Rosemarine, asking, should Israel jettison its extremist far-right government ministers?
So one has to first define what is an extremist far-right government minister. I assume that Andrew is speaking about Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir from the Otzma Yehudit and Jewish Home parties. Right now, these are two individuals who are key to Netanyahu's survival in government. So as long as Netanyahu, and this really relies on his Likud electorate, those who serve with him in government, decide that they have to be in power, A, because of Netanyahu's personal political survival, or B, because the same government which should be in power that was there at the start of the war should be there at the end of the war. They're not really playing politics as it relates to the management of this conflict. Remember, you have decisions which are being made by a national unity government. It is not Smotrich and Ben-Gvir who sit at the war cabinet. It is Eisenkot, it is Dermer, it is Netanyahu, it is Gantz, and Tzachi Braverman, the government secretary. So I think that in terms of managing the war, there's not going to be a change in the cabinet until the Gaza war ends on favorable terms for Israel. Whatever happens post that, I think that these ministers you're speaking about could be the politicians who stab Netanyahu in the back and cause his government to fall.
Thank you. Susan Blake asks, what happened with the new recruits on October 6th? Is that why there was no response for many hours after the attack from Hamas on October 7th? And is that classified?
There's actually a few reasons why October 6th bled into October 7th. It's not so much about new recruits. It's more about the overall operational readiness and the intelligence failures of the Israeli army and the Israeli security establishment that led to the actions on October 7th. So going back 15 years since Netanyahu became prime minister, one could make the argument that there has been a wide policy of appeasing Hamas after every round of conflict. This is what's called in the Israeli nomenclature, mowing the grass. There would be rockets which would be launched. There would be an Israeli response. There would be a ceasefire negotiated in Egypt, and everything would go back to business. Israel would send more humanitarian aid in, allow more money from the Qataris to flow into Gaza to placate Hamas. And Israel thought that after a round of conflict, Hamas was deterred. This proved to be a huge fallacy on October 7th, and that policy of appeasement has failed. On the more granular level of what happened on the border between Israel and Gaza, there was a few factors which contributed to Israel's not being ready for what happened. And I wouldn't blame it on new recruits. I would say that it dealt, first of all, with Israel not taking the threats that Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, made in multiple speeches over multiple years prior to it happening. There was a plan called Tufan al-Aqsa, the flood to Jerusalem, which is what Hamas's massacre was called on Hamas's side, that was actually leaked to the Israeli Ministry of Defense a few years prior to this. The Ministry of Defense had a red team, a group which was meant to think like the enemy, who had warned that an action like this could happen. It wasn't listened to. And in terms of the most micro detail, there was a meeting which took place between the chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, the head of the Shin Bet, and head of Israel, the IDF's operations directorate, at around 4:35 in the morning, about an hour before the attack took place, where there was a warning to Israel's senior military leadership that something was amidst on the Gaza-Israel border. Instead of deciding to send forces to reinforce Israel's border, they decided to sleep on it for 3 hours and reconvene at 8 in the morning. By that time, the massacre had already begun. So many other things will come out to the public's eye over the weeks and months and years to come, but it was a failure of the micro level, of the management level, of the political leadership, and of the state's readiness to be able to deal with a group like this, which led to October 7th happening, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Thank you. Eric asks, Israel has greatly reduced its forces in Gaza to its standing army. They broadcast where their army will attack next, allowing Hamas to prepare for the attack and hide the hostages. Do you still believe that Israel is fighting to completely destroy Hamas?
I do believe that Israel is still fighting to completely destroy Hamas, but what does that actually look like? Does it mean that the 30,000 members of the 8 brigades, or the 22 battalions that constituted Hamas's security forces, are completely wiped off the face of the earth? Do we take into account injuries? Do we take into account those who went AWOL, away without leave? Do we take into those account who were captured by Israel's security forces? Do we extend that 30,000 number to the 150 to 200,000 residents of Gaza that supported Hamas in non-military positions, whether they be local police, UNRWA teachers, clerks, accountants, lawyers, the dog catcher? I think my definition of destroying Hamas, and at least what I would urge the Israeli army to adopt, is one in which their senior leadership is extricated root and stem from Gaza, meaning they're either dead in the grave or they're expelled somewhere to a country which has control over them where they can't cause a problem for Israel anymore. In terms of those who are adherents of Hamas, they have to be taken off the Qatari, the PA, the UNRWA, and every other payroll and directly find their sustenance coming from Israeli-controlled sources. That doesn't mean that they receive their sustenance from Israel, but Israel has to approve it beforehand with a post-October 7th mindset. And in terms of the tactical and strategic reasons why Israel may be, as Eric says in quotes, broadcasting their location, I do believe that Israel has the means, has the plans, and has the ability to wipe out any future Hamas combatants who may pose a threat in Gaza. And in the end, it will have to do so in order to achieve its overall goal of total victory in the Gaza Strip.
Thank you. And then Jess follows up. How is the call for victory consistent with the idea that a solution in the north is for Hezbollah to just move a few miles back? Hezbollah has long-range rockets and missiles.
The idea of victory over Palestinian rejectionism is a different strategic goal than it is to deter Hezbollah. Hezbollah fights for a different reason than Hamas and the Palestinian Authority fight. Yes, at the end of the day, they would all be happy if all Israel's Jewish residents and citizens ended up in the sea or in a third country, which was not Israel. But Hezbollah has other considerations at play. I think Hezbollah is worried about domestic governance in Beirut. It's worried about a failing economy. It's worried about having its reason to exist, not just being a so-called resistance to the Zionists in the north and the occupied Sheba farms, as it claims in the Hassan Nasrallah speeches, but Hezbollah exists as a strategic deterrent on behalf of Iran, as what I would call a second strike capability, should Israel ever decide to hit Iran's nuclear facilities. It is there to deter Israel. It is not there to destroy Israel. Now, does it have the capability to inflict massive amounts of damage on Israel? Yes, it does. And it's part of a longer strategy, where Israel, as I said beforehand, one of my colleagues defined this as a seven-front war. It started in Gaza, it'll move to the West Bank, it'll then go to Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and finally end in Iran. If you consider total victory as a strategy by defeating those seven fronts, yes, they have to be dealt with. But this is not going to be something that happens overnight. I think Israel's placement is first to handle Hamas in Gaza, then it is to deal with Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas and Islamic Jihad supporters there. And then and only then will be able to focus the full force and might of the Israeli Defense Forces against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I think they'll meet a similar fate to Hamas. But for right now, the United States, Europe, especially France, are trying to urge Hezbollah to move to that 10-kilometer range so that Israeli towns in the north of the country are not in range of Hezbollah anti-tank fire, which has been the major factor plaguing Israel's security situation there, seeing over 500 houses destroyed in the last 4 months.
Thank you. Andrew Rosemarine follows up again. Isn't Israel's preoccupation with Gaza a possibly fatal distraction from Iran's nuclear bomb?
I don't know what's being discussed in the Security Cabinet right now. What I can tell you is that Israel, for the past 15 years and even longer, has had a long-term program on both disrupting the Iranian nuclear project and also trying to prevent what it sees as the inevitable enrichment of uranium to a level which will make it ready to have a rollout capacity to get a bomb. If I was Israel, as I said beforehand in my last answer, I would focus on Gaza at the beginning and I would end in Tehran by destroying the nuclear program at the end. But I just don't think that they have the means to do that right now. And perhaps to Israel's detriment, Iran has advanced its nuclear program, and we'll have to see what happens in the days and the weeks ahead.
Thank you. An anonymous attendee asks, what can you tell us, if anything, if there is anything to tell about the plan for Gaza's governance after the war? You spoke about deradicalization. What exactly does that look like and how?
So if I was a de-radicalization expert or a denazification expert, as some of Israel's media figures and members of its security establishment have spoken about, I'd be able to give you a plan right now. But when I served in the Israeli army, I was a civilian affairs specialist. And one of the things that we had to do was to approve curriculum that Palestinians would teach in their schools. Now, this was with UNRWA coming in and basically teaching Holocaust denial, the eradication of Jews, and the rejection of Israel as a Jewish state. We never approved that, but the textbooks that we didn't allow to go into Gaza were then printed locally on Hamas printing presses, and they were able to go out there. So first and foremost, Israel has to be able to screen the curriculum which is given at every single school in Gaza and in the West Bank. And if that means going in and raiding and tearing out pages from textbooks, I'd be fine with that. But the larger issue on that is making sure that not the material that they're learning from, but the teachers who are in the classroom are able to understand that their jobs are reliant on not teaching Jew hatred. And the same thing goes for the organizations which receive funding from international organizations. It's not just a task that Israel has to monitor, it's also something that Israel's allies and partners and those who fund Palestinians in Gaza and also the West Bank to that extent have to realize that Israel should not do business with any Palestinian or international entity which allows for radicalization to be, which allows their organizations to be a conveyor belt for Palestinian radicalization. And I think it's not going to happen overnight. In fact, I think what we're probably going to get is a situation where the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank end up under the leadership of a strongman, very much like in Jordan or in Egypt, where the people may see Israel as an opponent, but the leadership realizes that it's better for them to have good relations with Israel's government. And I don't know if we'll ever get to a full point where there's a true peace between Palestinian people and Israelis. I think we'll just probably get to the point where there's peace between Palestinian leadership and Israeli leadership. But the days of Oslo are over. Oslo died on October 7th.
Absolutely. That was a great distinction there. And we haven't spoken yet about the Biden administration. Edward Lipson would like to know, will the Biden administration bear hug succeed in impeding Israel's victory over Hamas?
I think I'll close on this. I have never heard Israeli ministers or members of Knesset speak both so frankly and openly about the need for Israel to be able to maintain its independence and its sovereignty in decision making, but also be so appreciative of the American administration. And it's sort of a contradiction, right? Israel wants to be independent and make its own decisions, but it doesn't have the capacity to arm itself. So I think in the short term, Israel has to play ball with the Biden administration in order to be able to achieve its goals in Gaza. But in the long term, there are Israeli plans to make it more autonomous and self-reliant on its ability to manufacture arms, manufacture ammunition, be able to fight longer wars, increase the size of the army. And it's moving to a point where it becomes an equal partner to the United States rather than being a supplicant or dependent on the United States. So the bear hug by Biden might be working in the short term, but it's forced Israel to squeeze out its own independent manufacturing capability in the long term.
Fantastic. Great way to end. So we've come to the end of our podcast. Thank you again, Gregg, for joining us today.
Thank you, Stacy.
Of course, for our viewers, please be on the lookout for our weekly webinar offerings email coming out over the weekend. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
If I could just add one thing, Stacy.
Of course.
We have a conference which is taking place in Washington, D.C. to discuss these issues on May 13th and May 15th. And I attend all of our podcast viewers and listeners to attend that event. For more information, you can write to info@meforum.org.
Thank you so much.